There's a word for the experience of meeting someone and feeling immediately, unmistakably certain. Not that they're good for you, but that they're familiar. Not safe, familiar. And the two things feel indistinguishable until they don't. If you've spent any time trying to understand your own patterns in love, you've probably already heard the version of this that doesn't quite satisfy. That your childhood shaped who you're attracted to. That you have a type. That it goes back to your parents somehow. And you probably nodded at that, because some part of it rings true, and then waited for the explanation that would actually tell you why. This video is that explanation. Not the shorthand. The mechanism. So let's start with what most people already know, and why knowing it hasn't been enough. Here is what most of the content on this topic does. It tells you that early experiences with caregivers create a template, and that you spend your adult life looking for someone who fits it. It tells you that if love felt anxious and uncertain when you were small, you might seek out anxious and uncertain love when you're grown. And that's not wrong. But it's not enough, because you probably already knew some version of that. And knowing it hasn't changed who you feel pulled toward. That's the part nobody explains well enough. Why understanding something intellectually doesn't reach the place where the pull actually lives. You can know with complete clarity that the person in front of you has the same emotional availability as someone who hurt you years ago. You can see the pattern written out on paper, you can have said it out loud in therapy, and still feel the pull, still feel that specific draw toward them that you don't feel toward the person who is actually demonstrably good to you. This is not a failure of self-awareness. It is not a sign that you haven't done enough work. It is a sign that the pull doesn't live in the part of you that reads and reflects and understands. It lives somewhere older than that, and that somewhere has a name. And understanding it, really understanding it, not just the phrase, is the only thing that has ever actually moved this. Now here's what's actually happening beneath all of that. Before you had language, before you could name what was happening around you, before you could form a sentence about whether you felt safe or not, your nervous system was already taking notes, not consciously, not in a way you could ever retrieve as a clear memory. But the body keeps a different kind of record. What early attachment research consistently shows is that the brain, in the first years of life, is building what researchers call an internal working model, a set of operating expectations about how relationships work, whether the person you need will come, whether your distress will be met, whether closeness is safe or whether it costs something. This model isn't a belief you chose, it isn't a conclusion you drew after weighing the evidence. It was built from repeated experience, below the level of conscious thought, in the part of the brain that processes threat and safety, not the part that reasons. And here is the part that doesn't get said clearly enough. That internal model doesn't just shape how you behave in relationships. It shapes what feels like a relationship, what registers in the body as connection, what reads to your nervous system as real. This is why the familiar doesn't just attract, it convinces. When you meet someone whose emotional texture, the way they give attention and then withdraw it, the way they're present and then somewhere else, the way closeness with them feels like something you have to earn, matches the emotional texture of early love, your nervous system doesn't flag that as a warning. It flags it as recognition, and recognition in the nervous system feels like coming home. But there's a deeper layer here. And this is the part that changes everything if you let it land all the way. Your nervous system does not distinguish between familiar and good. It distinguishes between familiar and unfamiliar. That's the whole mechanism. That's what's underneath years of choosing the person who makes you feel slightly uncertain, slightly like you have to prove something, slightly like the love is always 1 degree out of reach. It's not that you want to be hurt. It's not that you're self-sabotaging in any intentional sense. It's that your body learned a specific feeling tone, the emotional texture of the love that was available to you, and it indexed that feeling tone as what love is. And when you meet someone who produces that same feeling tone, every signal in your body says, this is it. This is what love feels like. This one is real. The person who is emotionally available, who is consistent, who shows up, who doesn't make you wonder, often doesn't produce that feeling. Not because there's something wrong with them, because the feeling tone is different, because calm doesn't feel like love if love has always felt like longing. And so you call it no chemistry. You call it nice but not right. You call it, I don't know, I just didn't feel it. And you move back toward the thing that feels like something. Not because you chose it, because your nervous system is loyal to the definition of love it was given before you were old enough to question it. Here is what that means. You have not been broken by your history. You have been shaped by it. And those are two completely different things. One is a verdict. One is a history. And a history, unlike a verdict, has a mechanism. And a mechanism, unlike a character flaw, can be understood well enough to interrupt. That is not optimism. That is how nervous systems actually work. If this framework is landing and you're starting to see the shape of your own emotional template, what comes next is applying it to your specific history. There's a workbook in the description called The Love History Audit. It's 8 structured exercises designed to help you map your own relationship history. Not to blame anyone in it, but to see clearly what pattern it produced and where that pattern actually came from. The link is in the description. Now, let's talk about what actually changes when you understand this at the level we've been working at. Because this is the objection that always arrives here. Someone is thinking, but I can't help who I'm attracted to, and that's true. You cannot decide, tonight, to feel chemistry with someone you don't feel it with. You cannot think your way into a different nervous system response. That is not what this video is asking. What changes is something more specific and more useful. When you understand that the pull toward the familiar is not romantic intuition but trained recognition, you gain something you didn't have before. You gain the ability to read the pull differently. Not to suppress it, not to override it with logic, but to hold it with a different kind of awareness. One that says, I feel this, and I also know where this feeling was built. That pause between the feeling and the action is where everything that can change actually begins. Research on what's sometimes called corrective emotional experience points to something consistent. The nervous system updates its model not through understanding alone, but through repeated encounters with something different. A relationship, even a small one, where closeness doesn't cost what it used to, where someone showing up steadily starts to feel less suspicious and more possible, where the absence of anxiety begins, slowly, to feel less like absence of feeling and more like the beginning of something you haven't had a word for yet. That accumulation is slow. It does not happen because you understood your childhood. It happens because you use that understanding to stay long enough in something different for your nervous system to start revising its map. You probably know the logical version of all of this. What this video has been doing is something different. It's been locating the mechanism, which is the only starting point worth anything. Because here is what is true. The template was written early. But you are not the child who wrote it. You are someone who can now read it. And reading it, really reading it, is the first act of authorship you've had over it. What you learned is not who you are. What you learned is what you were given. And what was given can, with time and the right conditions, be exchanged for something that fits better. This video gave you the framework. The workbook in the description, The Love History Audit, is where you apply it to your specific history. The link is there, and it's also in the pinned comment. When you think about the person who has felt most like home, what was the feeling tone they gave you? And where do you think you first learned that feeling? Before this ends, there's something worth naming directly. Most people who arrive at a video like this are carrying a version of the same question underneath it. Not just why do I keep choosing this, but does this mean I will always choose this? And the answer this video has been building toward is not reassurance. It's something more structural than that. The nervous system that learned to call familiar love learned it the way all nervous systems learn, through repetition, through experience that came before choice, through signals it received before it had any other frame of reference. And that same nervous system, the one that has been running this program, is capable of learning differently, not by deciding to, not by understanding enough to willpower its way into new feelings, but through the slow, often uncomfortable process of accumulating experiences that contradict the old model. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the entire thing. What you walked into this video believing, even if you couldn't have said it, was something like, the pattern is just who I am. What the evidence actually shows is different. The pattern is who you learn to be inside conditions you didn't choose. That is a history, not a verdict. And histories, unlike verdicts, can be read differently, can be understood rather than served, can be the beginning of something rather than the explanation for why nothing changes. The child who built that internal model was doing the most intelligent thing available to them. They were learning the rules of the world they were in. You are not that child anymore. You are someone who now knows where the rules came from. And knowing that, really knowing it, not just the phrase but the mechanism, is the first time you've been in a position to write new ones. That's not nothing. That's, in fact, where it starts.